Have you ever considered how a tiny, forgotten tribe from the dusty mountains of what is now Iran could rise up to control a territory so vast it stretched from modern-day Turkey all the way to India? It's a strange, almost unbelievable fact that a culture which, for centuries, was just a footnote to its more powerful neighbors, would one day be the master of the entire known world. They left behind a legacy of tolerance and monumental architecture that still baffles historians. And yet, this empire, this titan of antiquity, crumbled so completely and so quickly that its very memory was almost lost to time, buried beneath the sand and forgotten legends. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you're listening, why not let me know where in the world you're tuning in from and what time it is for you? It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. Now, let's go way back, past the well-trodden paths of Greece and Rome, and into the heartland of a story you might think you know, but you really don't. Our journey begins not with a king on a throne, but with a collection of nomads and the echoes of a kingdom that came before. The Persian Empire, as we've come to know it, didn't just pop into existence out of the blue. It had a long, slow fuse, and that fuse was lit in the rugged, sun-scorched lands of the Iranian plateau. For centuries before Cyrus the Great ever dreamed of conquest, this area was home to a powerful and sophisticated civilization known as the Elamites. Think of them as the big kids on the block, the ones with the cool toys and the long history, going all the way back to the dawn of writing itself. The Elamite kingdom, centered in the lowlands of what is now southwestern Iran, was a major player in the ancient Near East, a contemporary of the Sumerians and the Babylonians, with its capital at Susa. Their influence stretched across the plateau, and they were, for all intents and purposes, the dominant force in the region for thousands of years. They built massive ziggurats, developed their own unique script, and engaged in a complicated dance of war and trade with their neighbors in Mesopotamia. They were, in many ways, the cultural and political bedrock upon which the later empires would be built. It was into this world that the Indo-Iranian peoples, the ancestors of the Persians and Medes, began to migrate. They weren't a single, monolithic group, but rather a loose confederation of nomadic pastoralists who trickled down from the steppes of Central Asia. These tribes, with their horses and their unique religious beliefs, gradually settled into the more fertile regions of the plateau. Historians still argue whether their arrival was a peaceful integration or a more forceful migration. But one thing is certain: they eventually absorbed the local population and adopted some of the Elamite culture, even as they brought their own traditions with them. This process of cultural fusion is absolutely key to understanding the Persian Empire. It wasn't just an Indo-Iranian conquest. It was a synthesis of new and old, a melding of nomadic vigor with the ancient, settled wisdom of the Elamites. They learned to farm, to build, and to organize themselves politically, all while keeping their own language and a nascent sense of shared identity. Now, as these tribes settled, they began to differentiate. The Medes, who settled in the northwestern part of the plateau, were a bit quicker to form a cohesive, centralized kingdom. The Persians, on the other hand, remained a collection of smaller, more autonomous clans in the region known as Parsa or Perses in the southern Zagros Mountains. They were technically vassals of the Medes, a subordinate group paying tribute to their more powerful cousins. You can imagine a family get-together where one side of the family has the big house and the fancy car, and the other side is just sort of hanging out in the guest cottage, grumbling a bit. The Medes were the ones in the big house. They were the ones who had a king, a professional army, and a political structure strong enough to challenge the mighty Assyrian Empire to the west. Their rise to power was a slow but steady process, one that laid the groundwork for everything that was to follow. They built cities like Ecbatana, which would later become one of the great capitals of the Persian Empire. But for a long time, the Persians, the future masters of the world, were simply the junior partners in this arrangement, content, or maybe just forced, to live in the shadow of their Median overlords. It's in this complex world of Medes and Persians, with the ghost of the Elamites still lingering in the air, that our story truly begins to take shape. The stage is set for a new kind of empire, one that wouldn't just conquer, but would absorb and integrate. It's a fascinating, almost paradoxical origin story. The very people who would one day build the largest empire the world had ever seen started as a fragmented, almost insignificant group, beholden to another. They weren't born into greatness. They had to earn it, to plot it, and to seize it from their own blood relatives. And that, my friends, is where things start to get really interesting. So, with the Persians just sort of buttering around in the south, the true power players in the region were their cousins, the Medes. They were the ones who had really figured things out. And our story of their ascendancy starts with a figure who may or may not have been a real person, a king named Deioces, according to the Greek historian Herodotus, a man who, bless his heart, sometimes got his facts from what can only be described as ancient gossip. Deioces was the first king of a unified Median state. Now, whether he was a real historical figure or just a convenient narrative device to explain how the Medes went from a bunch of scattered tribes to a single kingdom, the story is a good one, so let's stick with it. He was said to be a wise judge in his small village, so fair and impartial that people from all over started coming to him to settle their disputes. It was like a medieval version of Judge Judy, but with more sheep and fewer commercial breaks. His reputation grew so much that the other Median tribes, tired of constant feuding and the threat from their powerful Assyrian neighbors, decided he was the only man who could unite them. So, they elected him as their king. His first act as king, according to the same tale, was to build a capital city, and not just any city. He built Ecbatana, a city so grand and well fortified that it became the stuff of legend. The city was said to have been built with 7 concentric walls, each one higher than the last, with each successive wall painted a different color. The innermost wall, where the king's palace was located, was said to have been plated in gold and silver, a truly impressive bit of ancient bling. He ruled from inside these walls, a kind of reclusive, distant monarch, maintaining control by dispatching his judgments and his guards from behind the fortress. This new political entity, this Median kingdom, was a game changer. It was the first time that a powerful, organized force had emerged on the Iranian plateau, and it provided a blueprint for the Persians who would follow. It was a model of centralized authority, an administrative structure, and a military machine that could stand up to the established superpowers of the time. The Medes had a particular beef with the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrians, who were centered in northern Mesopotamia, were the regional bullies, known for their ruthless military campaigns and their policy of mass deportation. They were basically the ancient world's most aggressive and least liked neighbor. The Medes, along with their allies, the Babylonians, finally had enough. Under a king named Cyaxares, the Medes grew strong enough to challenge Assyrian dominance. In a series of brutal and hard-fought campaigns, the Medes and Babylonians formed an alliance and finally brought down the great Assyrian Empire. They sacked the Assyrian capital of Nineveh in 612 BCE, an event that sent shockwaves throughout the ancient world. The fall of Nineveh was a monumental moment. It marked the end of the Assyrian terror and cleared the way for new empires to rise. The Medes and Babylonians divvied up the spoils, with the Medes taking control of the northern part of the Assyrian territories, including parts of modern-day Turkey and a significant chunk of the Iranian plateau. Now, as the Medes were busy carving out their own empire, they kept the Persians, their kinsmen, as loyal vassals. The Persians were a junior partner in this empire, a kind of subordinate ally, providing soldiers and tribute to the Median king. The Persian prince who would one day change everything, a young man named Cyrus, was growing up in this world. He was the son of Cambyses the Fourth, a local Persian king, and Mandane, the daughter of the Median king Astyages. This familial connection is super important, so try to remember it. It was this relationship, this link between the two royal houses, that would set the stage for the dramatic events to come. While Cyrus was being raised, the Median Empire was at its height. They were a military and political powerhouse, with a king who, by all accounts, felt pretty secure on his throne. What could possibly go wrong? The Median kings, from Cyaxares to his son Astyages, were successful and powerful. They had a sophisticated court, they controlled vast territories, and they were the masters of the Iranian plateau. They had built an empire, albeit a much smaller one than the one that would eventually replace it. They had a strong military, and their control over the Persians seemed absolute. They were, for all intents and purposes, the dominant force in the region, the ones who had emerged from the shadow of the Assyrians to create something new and powerful. But empires, as we'll learn, are a lot like those giant Jenga towers. You can get away with a lot of little wiggles and shifts, but eventually, one wrong move, one little tremor, and the whole thing comes crashing down. The Medes, in their arrogance, in their overconfidence, were about to make a move they would regret, a move that would inadvertently unleash the very force that would one day consume them whole. With the Medes enjoying their time as top dogs, our story shifts to the man who would one day change everything, Cyrus the Great. But his story, as told by our favorite ancient gossiper, Herodotus, is less a tale of destiny and more a dramatic origin story that would make a great Netflix series. It begins, as all good stories do, with a strange dream. The Median king, Astyages, was the doting grandfather to a baby boy named Cyrus, the son of his daughter Mandane, and the Persian king, Cambyses III. But one night, Astyages has a dream that's about as unsettling as they come. In the dream, his daughter Mandane urinates so much that a flood of water bursts forth and engulfs his capital city, then the entire continent of Asia. Astyages, as you might imagine, wakes up in a cold sweat. He consults the magi, the wise men and priests of the Median court, and they tell him what he already suspects. This dream is a prophecy, and it means his grandson, Cyrus, is destined to overthrow him and take his kingdom. A bit of a buzzkill for a new grandpa. So, in a move that seems right out of a fairy tale, Astyages decides he can't have this kid running around, destined to ruin his life. He calls for his most trusted courtier, a man named Harpagus, and orders him to take the baby Cyrus and kill him. Harpagus, a guy who probably just wanted to get through the day without having to murder a child, can't bring himself to do it. Instead, he passes the baby off to a shepherd named Mithridates, giving him the same gruesome order. Now, Mithridates and his wife, a woman named Spatzo, had just gone through the tragedy of a stillbirth. They were heartbroken, and here was this perfect, healthy baby boy. In a twist of fate that only happens in these kinds of stories, they decide to swap the babies. They take their own deceased infant, dress it in the royal swaddling clothes, and present it to Harpagus as the dead Cyrus. Harpagus, not checking for a pulse, reports back to Astyages that the deed is done. Cyrus, meanwhile, is raised by the shepherd and his wife, completely unaware of his royal lineage. He's just a regular kid, playing in the fields and learning how to herd sheep. A future king living a life of humble anonymity. But you can't keep a good king down. As Cyrus grows up, his natural leadership qualities shine through. One day, while playing with other boys in the village, they play a game of king. Cyrus, naturally, is chosen as the king, and he starts giving orders a bit too seriously. He even has one of the other boys, a nobleman's son, publicly whipped for disobeying his command. This kid, not used to being treated this way, runs to his father, who complains to Astyages. The Median king, curious about this boy who acts so imperiously, has him brought to court. He sees the boy, recognizes a striking family resemblance, and after a little bit of prodding, forces the truth out of the shepherd. Harpagus, you can imagine, is sweating profusely at this point. Astyages realizes he's been duped. He doesn't punish Harpagus for his deception, or at least not in a straightforward way. Instead, he invites him to a grand feast, promising to make it up to him. He serves Harpagus a spectacular meal, and at the end of the night, reveals that the meat Harpagus had been eating was, in fact, his own son. It's a moment of utterly brutal, shocking revenge. A move that proves Astyages is not to be trifled with. As for Cyrus, Astyages consults the Magi again, who give him a sort of metaphysical get-out-of-jail-free card. They tell him the prophecy has already been fulfilled, that by playing at being king, Cyrus has used up his destiny and is no longer a threat. Astyages, who probably just wanted to get rid of the boy without more bloodshed, takes this as a sign and sends Cyrus back to his parents in Persia, figuring he's no longer a threat. Historians still argue whether this tale is a fabrication or based on a real event? There's a good chance it's a bit of both. The point is, Cyrus, the future conqueror of empires, was raised as a commoner. This gave him a perspective that most kings never have. He knew what it was like to be an ordinary person, and that understanding would later define his compassionate and tolerant rule. But for now, he was a young man, back with his family, with a thirst for revenge on a grandfather who had tried to kill him and brutally murdered his friend. And so Cyrus, the young Persian prince with a shepherd's past, grows into a man. He's charismatic, a natural leader, and he has a powerful secret ally, Harpagus, the courtier who had been wronged in the most horrific way, had been biding his time, secretly communicating with Cyrus and encouraging him to rise up. The seeds of rebellion were sown. The Medes, so long the dominant power, had grown complacent under the rule of Astyages, a king more interested in courtly life than military strength. The stage was set for a dramatic reversal of fortune. The young upstart, a man with a personal vendetta and a secret network of conspirators, was ready to challenge the status quo, to take on the very empire that had raised and then betrayed him. And this time, he wouldn't be playing a game. With the Medes blissfully unaware of the storm brewing on their southern flank, Cyrus and his co-conspirator, Harpagus, began to set their plan into motion. The Persians, who had long been the junior partners in this arrangement, were more than ready to throw off the yoke of Median rule. They had a natural leader in Cyrus, a man who, you'll remember, was not only of royal blood, but had also been forged in the crucible of a shepherd's life. He knew how to inspire loyalty, and he had a deep, personal reason for seeking revenge against his grandfather, the Median king Astyages. This wasn't just a political uprising, it was a personal vendetta. And that kind of motivation is a powerful, dangerous thing. Cyrus first rallied the Persian tribes, convincing them that the time was ripe to challenge their Median overlords. The Medes, under Astyages, had grown soft and complacent. Their military machine, once a force of terror against the Assyrians, had atrophied. Astyages, in a move that feels almost comically arrogant in hindsight, didn't lead his own forces against the rebellion. Instead, he sent Harpagus, the very man whose son he had brutally murdered, to put down the rebellion. It was a spectacular bit of poor judgment, a move that sealed his fate. Harpagus, as you might expect, had no intention of being a good little soldier. At the first opportunity, he and his forces defected to Cyrus's side. The Median army, demoralized and led by a man who secretly hated his king, began to unravel. The final confrontation between Cyrus and Astyages was not the great, bloody affair you might expect. The Medes, their army melting away, were no match for the determined Persian forces. Astyages was captured, his rule over the Iranian plateau at an end. But here's where Cyrus shows us the first signs of the leadership style that would define his reign. Instead of executing his grandfather, as was common practice for conquerors, he spared Astyages' life and treated him well. He even made him a governor of a distant province. It was a calculated move, one that showed mercy and tolerance, and it sent a clear message to the world. This new king was not like the old ones. He didn't rule through fear alone. He ruled through a kind of benevolent authority. The Persians, once a subordinate people, were now the masters of the Median Empire. and Cyrus was their king. With the Medes now under his thumb, Cyrus turned his attention to a new and much richer target, the kingdom of Lydia. Lydia, located in modern-day Western Turkey, was ruled by a man whose name has become synonymous with wealth, King Croesus. You know the phrase, as rich as Croesus. That's this guy. His kingdom was swimming in gold, thanks to the deposits found in the Pactolus River. He was a powerful king, a close ally of the Babylonians and the Egyptians, and he felt pretty secure in his domain. But Croesus, like Astyages, had a strange dream that made him nervous about Cyrus. So, he did what any self-respecting ancient king would do. He consulted the Oracle of Delphi. The oracle gave him a famously cryptic response. If Croesus goes to war, he will destroy a great empire. Croesus, misinterpreting the prophecy to mean he would destroy Cyrus's empire, decided to launch an attack. He didn't realize the oracle was being a bit of a trickster. The campaign against Lydia was swift. Croesus, leading his forces across the border, engaged Cyrus's army in a preliminary battle that was a draw. Croesus, figuring the fighting season was over and he could go back to his gold-plated palace, pulled his troops back. Cyrus, on the other hand, a man who was clearly not a fan of quitting early, pursued him. He laid siege to the Lydian capital of Sardis. The city was thought to be impregnable, built on a high plateau with sheer cliffs on three sides. It had only one point of access, which was heavily fortified. The Persians, after a difficult siege, finally found a way in. A Persian soldier, noticing a Lydian defender, accidentally drop his helmet and then scramble down a part of the cliff that seemed impossible to retrieve it, realized there was a hidden path. The Persians used this path to climb the cliffs, sneak into the city, and capture it. The great city of Sardis had fallen. Croesus, now a captive, was brought before Cyrus. The new king, in a moment that cemented his reputation, did not put Croesus to death. Instead, he spared him, and according to some sources, even made him a trusted advisor. Croesus, it turned out, had destroyed a great empire, just as the oracle had predicted. The empire was his own. This act of mercy, this willingness to integrate rather than annihilate, was not just a one-off. It was the policy that Cyrus would follow throughout his reign. He would conquer, yes, but he wouldn't raise cities or enslave populations. He would absorb them, allow them to keep their customs and their religion, and make them a part of his growing empire. This was a completely new approach to conquest in the ancient world, and it was a large part of why the Persian Empire would grow so quickly and last so long. With the Lydian kingdom now under his command, Cyrus had effectively secured his western frontier. The conquest had not only brought him immense wealth, but had also put him on the geopolitical map in a way that the defeat of the Medes never could. He was now a king of kings, a new player in a very old game. But there was one final and most magnificent piece of the puzzle to conquer: Babylon. The city, a glittering jewel of the ancient world, was the capital of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and it was ruled by a man named Nabonidus. To be fair, Nabonidus was a bit of an odd duck. He was more interested in archaeology and the worship of a moon god named Sin than he was in the day-to-day affairs of his empire. In fact, he spent a significant amount of time away from the capital, leaving his son, Belshazzar, in charge. The Babylonians, particularly the priests of their patron god Marduk, were not amused. The stage for the conquest of Babylon was set with a bit of internal drama. Nabonidus's religious policies had alienated a powerful segment of the population, and his prolonged absence from the capital had created a power vacuum. This discontent was exactly what Cyrus needed. He didn't just show up with a giant army. He had a PR campaign. He sent messages ahead of his army, portraying himself as a liberator, a true servant of the gods who would restore Marduk's rightful place and bring order back to the chaos. The Babylonians, suffering under the misrule of Nabonidus and Belshazzar, were more than willing to believe him. The story goes that they practically opened the gates for him. The city of Babylon itself was a fortress, a wonder of ancient engineering. It was built on the Euphrates River, with massive, thick walls that were considered impregnable. The river itself flowed through the middle of the city, providing a constant supply of water and a natural defense. Getting inside was thought to be a fool's errand, but Cyrus was nothing if not a brilliant strategist. The Persian army, under the command of a general named Gobryas, marched on the city. The Babylonian forces, under Belshazzar, came out to meet them in a battle that was swift and decisive. The Babylonians were routed, and Belshazzar fled back to the city. Now, with the city locked down, Cyrus had to figure out how to get inside. The story that has come down to us, made famous by Herodotus, is a classic bit of ancient ingenuity. The Persians began to divert the flow of the Euphrates River, digging a channel to draw the water away from the city. They worked in silence, under the cover of night, with the Babylonians inside the city, feeling pretty secure. Belshazzar, in fact, was said to be throwing a huge feast, probably to celebrate their supposed invulnerability. While they were feasting and drinking, the Persians continued their work, and the river level inside the city dropped. Eventually, it dropped low enough that the Persian soldiers could wade through the riverbed, right under the city walls and through the river gates, which had, in a moment of spectacular carelessness, been left open. The city fell without a fight. The Babylonians woke up the next morning to find Persian soldiers standing on their street corners. Historians still argue whether this account is literally true or a bit of dramatic license. But what is clear is that the conquest of Babylon was relatively bloodless, and it was the result of a clever plan. Cyrus, upon entering the city, didn't do what the Assyrians or other conquerors would have done. He didn't raze the temples, didn't slaughter the inhabitants, and didn't tear down the walls. He was welcomed as a liberator, and he acted like one. He issued a proclamation known as the Cyrus Cylinder, a clay artifact that now resides in the British Museum. This cylinder, which is often called the First Declaration of Human Rights, is a remarkable document. On it, Cyrus declares that he has restored peace to the land, that he has freed the people, that he has returned the sacred statues of the gods to their rightful temples, and that he has allowed the exiled peoples to return to their homes. This last part is the most famous, as it refers specifically to the Jewish people, who had been held captive in Babylon for decades. Cyrus's decree allowed them to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. This act of compassion and tolerance wasn't just a PR stunt. It was a fundamental part of Cyrus's political philosophy. He understood that ruling a vast multi-ethnic empire was not about brute force. It was about integration and loyalty. By allowing people to worship their own gods and follow their own customs, he made them willing participants in his empire, not just reluctant subjects. He had conquered the most powerful city in the known world, and he had done it with a combination of military prowess and political wisdom. With Babylon under his control, Cyrus was now the master of all of Mesopotamia and the Near East. The Persian Empire, a fledgling state just a few decades earlier, had become a true superpower, and its rise was due almost entirely to the genius of one man. With Babylon under his control, Cyrus the Great had established an empire of unprecedented size and scope. His kingdom now stretched from the Aegean Sea to the borders of India, a truly mind-boggling amount of territory for one man to govern. But it was not just the conquest that made Cyrus great. It was what he did afterward. His approach to governance was a radical departure from the brutal, iron-fisted rule of the Assyrians and even the Medes. Instead of a scorched earth policy, he pursued a strategy of religious and cultural tolerance. This was not just a moral choice, it was a brilliant political move. He understood that a vast, multi-ethnic empire could not be held together by force alone. It needed loyalty, and loyalty was earned. The most famous example of this policy, and one that resonates to this day, is his decree regarding the Jewish exiles in Babylon. For decades, the people of Judah had been living in exile, a result of the Babylonian conquest of Jerusalem. They were a stateless people, their temple destroyed, their identity under threat. But when Cyrus came to power, he issued a decree allowing them to return to their homeland and rebuild their temple. This act, documented in the biblical books of Ezra and Isaiah, was a monumental moment in Jewish history. The Bible even refers to Cyrus as the Lord's Anointed, a title usually reserved for the kings of Israel. This wasn't a one-off act of kindness. He also repatriated the statues of other gods to their rightful temples and allowed their priests to return to their duties. He was, in essence, a master of soft power, winning hearts and minds by respecting local customs and religions. His genius was in understanding the psychological aspect of rule. He didn't demand that his subjects abandon their gods and embrace Persian ones. He didn't force them to speak the Persian language or adopt Persian customs. Instead, he allowed them to be themselves, a policy that made them more likely to be loyal subjects. This approach created a sense of stability and belonging that the Assyrians, with their policy of forced deportation, could never achieve. The result was a stable and prosperous empire, where trade flourished and new ideas could travel freely across vast distances. The famous Cyrus cylinder, now in the British Museum, is a testament to this philosophy. On it, written in Babylonian cuneiform, Cyrus proclaims his lineage and his conquests, but then goes on to describe his benevolent rule, his respect for local gods, and his commitment to restoring order and peace. It's essentially an ancient press release, and a very good one at that. But Cyrus was not just a benevolent ruler, he was also a builder. He established the first Persian capital at Pasargadae, a city in the heart of his homeland. It was a city designed to reflect his vision of the empire, a grand, open, and multicultural place. The architectural style was a blend of Median, Persian, and even Babylonian influences, a physical embodiment of his policy of integration. The gardens, or Peridesa, as they were called in Old Persian, were a new concept, a kind of walled paradise that would later influence garden design across the world. His tomb, a relatively simple, gabled structure on a raised platform, still stands there today, a powerful symbol of his legacy. It is not the grand, over-the-top monument you might expect from a king who ruled the known world. Instead, it's a humble, elegant structure, fitting for a man who, by all accounts, was more of a wise leader than a self-aggrandizing despot. The death of Cyrus the Great is shrouded in a bit of mystery. According to Herodotus, he was killed in battle while fighting against a nomadic tribe on the eastern frontier. The story is a dramatic one, with the queen of the tribe, Tomyris, said to have beheaded him and plunged his head into a bag of blood, a gruesome act of revenge for the death of her son. Historians still argue whether this account is literally true or just a cautionary tale about a great king overextending his reach. What is clear is that he died around 530 BCE, leaving behind an empire that was still a work in progress. He had laid the foundation, but it was up to his successors to build the full structure. He had been a conqueror, a liberator, a genius, and perhaps, most importantly, a revolutionary. He had shown the world that an empire could be built not just with a sword, but with a philosophy. And his son, Cambyses, was about to inherit this sprawling, beautiful mess. Now, with Cyrus gone, the weight of the sprawling Persian Empire fell on the shoulders of his son, Cambyses II. He inherited a kingdom of unprecedented size and complexity, and unlike his father, who had been a master of diplomacy and soft power, Cambyses was more of a military man, a conqueror in the traditional no-nonsense sense. His reign is largely defined by one massive, ambitious, and ultimately brutal campaign: the conquest of Egypt. The ancient land of the pharaohs had long been a major power in the Near East, a civilization steeped in thousands of years of history, with a military that had, up to this point, been able to resist Assyrian and Babylonian incursions. Conquering Egypt was a big deal, a way for Cambyses to not only expand the empire, but also to cement his own legacy as a powerful king. It was a classic "daddy did it, so I have to too" situation, but with a lot more swords. The pretext for the invasion is a bit murky, as these things often are. One story says that Cambyses asked the Egyptian pharaoh, Amasis II, for one of his daughters in marriage. Amasis, being a savvy old ruler, sent a different woman, a commoner disguised as a princess, to marry Cambyses. When the ruse was discovered, Cambyses was so enraged that he vowed to invade Egypt. Another story suggests it was more of a geopolitical necessity. Egypt was a powerful rival, a potential threat on the western flank of the empire, and conquering it would secure the entire region. Whatever the reason, Cambyses gathered a massive army and set off for Egypt. He had a secret weapon, or at least a powerful ally, in a Greek mercenary named Phanes, who had defected from Egypt and knew the lay of the land, providing him with invaluable intelligence. The campaign began with a decisive victory at the Battle of Pelusium in 525 BCE. The city, a key fortress on the eastern border of Egypt, was the gateway to the Nile Valley. The story goes that the Persians, used a clever and bizarre psychological tactic to win the day. Knowing the Egyptians held cats in a special, almost sacred regard, the Persians painted images of cats on their shields and drove a number of them in front of their army. The Egyptians, perhaps not wanting to harm the animals, were hesitant to shoot their arrows and fight with the same ferocity. This, combined with the superior Persian numbers and tactics, led to a crushing defeat for the Egyptians. While this story is likely apocryphal, it highlights the fact that the Persians did win a major victory and paved the way for their march into the heart of Egypt. Cambyses' rule in Egypt, however, was not like his father's. While Cyrus was known for his tolerance, Cambyses was, by most accounts, seen as a ruthless tyrant by the Egyptians. He was accused of desecrating temples, mocking the local gods, and even killing the sacred Apis bull, a revered symbol of the god Ptah. While some modern historians argue that this is a biased account from Greek sources who were hostile to the Persians, the perception of Cambyses was one of a cruel and unstable ruler. His reign in Egypt was marked by an incident that has baffled historians for centuries. He sent a massive army of 50,000 men to attack an oracle in the Siwa oasis. But the entire army vanished without a trace, swallowed by a sandstorm in the vast Sahara Desert. It's one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries, a sort of ancient X-file. While Cambyses was away on his Egyptian campaign, things back home began to unravel. A man claiming to be Cambyses' younger brother, Bardia, or Smerdis, as he's known in Greek sources, rose up and seized the throne. This man was a Magian priest named Gaumata, who bore a striking resemblance to the real Bardia. The real Bardia had been secretly assassinated by Cambyses before he left for Egypt. A bit of sibling rivalry that came back to bite him in the posterior. The news of the usurpation was a devastating blow to Cambyses. He abandoned his Egyptian campaign and began the long journey back to Persia to reclaim his throne. But on the way, in a moment of either despair or a strange accident, he died. The exact circumstances of his death are debated. Herodotus claims he accidentally stabbed himself in the thigh, in the exact same spot where he had previously stabbed the Apis bull, a kind of poetic and grisly divine retribution. Cambyses' death left the empire in chaos. The usurper, Gaumata, the Magian priest, was now the undisputed king of the greatest empire the world had ever seen. The man who had ruled with such ambition and such cruelty had died a pathetic death, his legacy forever stained by his actions in Egypt and the chaos he left behind. The empire that Cyrus had built with so much care and respect was now in the hands of a fraud. But there was one man, a young noble of royal blood, who was about to step out of the shadows and save the empire from falling apart. With the death of Cambyses II and the rise of the impostor, Gaumata, the Persian Empire was teetering on the edge of chaos. The Magian priest, a member of a priestly caste known for their religious power, had seized the throne by claiming to be the long-lost brother of Cambyses. His deception worked for a time, as he issued decrees and ruled from the royal palaces. But a handful of Persian nobles knew the truth. They knew that the real Bardia was dead, assassinated in secret before Cambyses had even left for Egypt. The empire was now in the hands of a usurper, a commoner, and a religious leader who didn't have a drop of Achaemenid royal blood in his veins. This was a crisis of legitimacy. and it was about to be solved by a man who would become one of the greatest kings in Persian history, Darius, Darius the Third, who would later be known as Darius the Great, was not a son of Cyrus. He was a distant cousin, a member of a cadet branch of the Achaemenid family. He had been a loyal spear-bearer to Cambyses, a high-ranking officer in the Persian army. He was a young man, but he was ambitious, shrewd, and most importantly, he knew the secret of Gaumata's deception. He rallied 6 other noble conspirators, men who were also loyal to the old dynasty and who saw the impostor as a threat to their power and the stability of the empire. They met in secret, plotting to overthrow the fake king. Historians still argue whether their motivation was pure patriotism or a desire to seize power for themselves. Perhaps it was a bit of both, as these things usually are. The plot culminated in a daring raid on the fortress of a place called Sikayavati. The conspirators, with Darius at their head, stormed the fortress, found Gaumata and his brother, and in a moment of bloody vengeance, killed them both. It was a shocking and dangerous move. They were 7 men against a king, and they had succeeded. With Gaumata dead, the conspirators had to decide who would rule. Herodotus gives us a fun but probably fictional account of this process. He says the 7 men gathered and debated the best form of government for the empire. One man argued for democracy, another for oligarchy, and a third, Darius, for monarchy. Darius's argument that a single ruler was best for swift decision-making and preventing corruption won the day. So, they decided to choose a king in a most peculiar way. They would ride out at dawn, and the man whose horse neighed first would be king. Darius, a man who was clearly not above a little bit of animal-based trickery, supposedly rubbed his horse's saddle with the scent of a mare. And, sure enough, his horse neighed first. And just like that, Darius was king. But his ascension was not the end of the story. It was just the beginning. The empire was in a state of civil war. The provinces, which had grown accustomed to the instability and had maybe even been encouraged by the impostor, rose up in a series of widespread revolts. The very act of killing Gaumata had shattered the illusion of stability and unleashed a wave of rebellion across the vast empire. From Elam and Media to Babylon and even Egypt, every corner of the kingdom was in open revolt. For almost a year, Darius was constantly on the march, fighting and putting down rebellions. He was a warrior king, a man who had to earn his throne not with an edict, but with a sword. He personally led his forces, moving from one rebellious province to the next, often against staggering odds. He faced a new, even more determined impostor in Babylon, a man claiming to be Nebuchadnezzar, the last great king of the Babylonian Empire. Darius had to retake the great city twice, a testament to the scale of the challenge he faced. In Media, he faced a revolt by a man claiming to be a descendant of the old Median kings, a rebellion that had the potential to unravel the entire empire. He had to be ruthless, decisive, and relentless. He executed rebel leaders, put down uprisings with an iron fist, and re-established control through military might. The contrast with Cyrus's gentle, almost peaceful reign couldn't have been starker. While Cyrus had built the empire, Darius had to save it from itself. To commemorate his victories and legitimize his rule, Darius commissioned a monumental inscription carved high into a cliff face at a place called Behistun. The Behistun inscription is one of the most important archaeological finds in history, written in three languages: Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian. It tells the story of his ascension to the throne and his battles against the 9 rebellious kings. It's a bit of ancient propaganda, with Darius portraying himself as a divinely chosen king, a true ruler chosen by the god Ahura Mazda to restore order to the world. It was a massive undertaking, carved so high on the cliff face that it would be almost impossible for anyone to tamper with it. The inscription was a loud, clear message to the empire. The pretenders were gone, the chaos was over, and a new, legitimate king was in charge. This remarkable artifact provided the key to deciphering cuneiform scripts and unlocked our understanding of the ancient Near East. With the last of the rebellions crushed and his authority firmly established, Darius III could finally turn his attention from saving the empire to running it. And what an empire it was, stretching from modern-day Libya to Afghanistan. It was a colossal, sprawling, and incredibly diverse territory. Darius, a man who had earned his throne through brutal military action, understood that an empire this big couldn't be ruled by force alone. It needed an entirely new system of governance, a structure that was both efficient and centralized, but also flexible enough to manage a kaleidoscope of different cultures, languages, and religions. His solution was brilliant and would become the blueprint for future empires for centuries to come. He divided the empire into a series of provinces, known as satrapies. There were about 20 of these satrapies, and each one was a little mini-kingdom. At the head of each was a satrap, or a governor, who was appointed by the king and was often a member of the Persian nobility. The satrap was responsible for a lot of things: collecting taxes, administering justice, and keeping the peace. But here's the clever part. Darius didn't put all the power in one person's hands. He set up a system of checks and balances. The military commander in each satrapy reported directly to the king, not to the satrap. And even more importantly, he created a network of royal inspectors, often referred to as the king's eyes and ears. These were a kind of ancient internal affairs department, traveling around the empire, showing up unannounced, and reporting back to the king on the satrap's performance. This ingenious system prevented any single satrap from getting too powerful or building up a personal army to challenge the king. But an empire this big also needed a way to communicate and move goods quickly. The old system, relying on slow, uncoordinated messengers, was just not going to cut it. So, Darius commissioned the construction of the royal road. This wasn't just a simple path. It was a marvel of ancient engineering, a network of well-maintained, purpose-built roads that spanned a ridiculous distance. The most famous segment stretched for more than 1,600 miles, from the city of Susa in the heart of Persia, all the way to Sardis in Lydia. Along the road, at regular intervals, were a series of stations with fresh horses and riders. A message could travel from one end of the road to the other in about a week, a speed that was unheard of in the ancient world. The Greek historian Herodotus, a man who loved a good piece of trivia, famously wrote of the Persian messengers that neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds. It's a quote that sounds a lot like the modern-day USPS motto for a reason. The Royal Road wasn't just for messengers, of course. It facilitated trade, allowing goods to flow freely across the empire. And it was a vital part of the military's ability to respond to revolts. It was, in many ways, the internet of the ancient world, a system that connected a fragmented empire and made it feel more like a cohesive whole. Darius also standardized a system of weights and measures and introduced a unified currency, the daric, that a gold coin, and the siglos, a silver coin. This new economic system was a boon for merchants and traders, eliminating the complicated bartering and exchange rates that had plagued the ancient world. It was a kind of ancient EU, a single market that encouraged commerce and generated enormous wealth for the empire. In addition to these administrative and economic reforms, Darius was also a great builder. He moved the administrative capital to Susa, but he began a monumental construction project at a new, beautiful site, Persepolis. This wasn't just a city, it was a grand ceremonial capital, a place for the king to hold court, receive tribute, and show off the magnificence of the Persian Empire. The palace complex, built on a huge artificial terrace, was a stunning blend of different architectural styles, with massive columns, intricate reliefs, and grand staircases. The reliefs, in particular, are a window into the mind of Darius. They showed delegations from all the different satrapies, each in their own distinctive dress, bringing gifts to the king. It was a visual representation of his vision for the empire, a harmonious collection of diverse peoples, all united under the benevolent rule of a single king. After consolidating his immense empire and building his grand ceremonial capital at Persepolis, Darius could finally breathe a sigh of relief. He had created a political and economic machine unlike any the world had ever seen. The satrapies were functioning. The royal road was a humming highway of information and trade, and a standardized currency was making everyone's life easier. But all this tranquility was about to be shattered by a pesky problem on his western border. The Greeks. The Persians had already conquered the Greek cities of Ionia on the western coast of Anatolia and had incorporated them into the empire. But the mainland Greeks, especially Athens and Sparta, were a different breed. They were a collection of independent city-states, each with their own form of government and a fierce, almost pig-headed love of liberty. The trouble started when the Ionian Greeks, feeling the pinch of Persian rule and resentful of the pro-Persian tyrants who had been installed to govern them, decided to revolt. This event is known as the Ionian Revolt, and it began in 499 BCE. They appealed to the mainland Greeks for help, and while most of the cities balked, Athens and a small city called Eretria sent a handful of ships and soldiers. This wasn't a huge force, but it was enough to make a statement. The Athenian-backed forces sailed to Sardis, the old Lydian capital, and burned the city to the ground. This was a monumental slap in the face to the great king. An old story, probably apocryphal, says that when Darius heard the news, he was so enraged that he ordered one of his servants to repeat the phrase, "Master, remember the Athenians," 3 times before every dinner. Whether true or not, it captures the utter shock and fury that the Persian king must have felt. The Ionian revolt was eventually put down with an iron fist, but Darius wasn't about to let the insult stand. Athens had dared to challenge the power of the Achaemenid Empire, and they had to be punished. This wasn't about conquest, at least, not at first. It was about retribution, about sending a clear message to the Greek world that they could not meddle in Persian affairs without consequences. So, in 492 BCE, Darius sent a large expeditionary force to Greece, led by his son-in-law, Mardonius. The expedition, however, was a disaster. The Persian fleet was wrecked in a storm off the coast of Mount Athos, a kind of ancient maritime tragedy that forced the rest of the army to turn back. This was a temporary reprieve for the Greeks, but everyone knew it was only a matter of time before Darius tried again. The second attempt, in 490 BCE, was much more successful, at least at first. This time, the Persian fleet sailed directly across the Aegean Sea, successfully subjugating the islands and landing on the Greek mainland at a place called Marathon, a short distance from Athens. The Persian army, with its superior numbers and fearsome reputation, was a terrifying sight. The Athenians, on the other hand, had a small, poorly equipped army, and they were alone. They had sent a runner to Sparta for help, but the Spartans, who were in the middle of a religious festival, said they couldn't march until the festival was over. It was up to the Athenians and a small contingent from the city of Plataea to face the mighty Persian force alone. The commander of the Athenian army was a man named Miltiades, a brilliant general who knew that to fight the Persians in the open field would be suicide. The battle itself, the famous Battle of Marathon, was a masterclass in tactical genius. Miltiades had his forces, composed of heavily armored foot soldiers known as hoplites, form a defensive line. He thinned out his center to make his flanks stronger, a risky move that paid off spectacularly. When the Persians charged, their elite archers and cavalry were unable to break the Athenian line. The Athenian flanks, meanwhile, enveloped the Persians, catching them in a pincer movement that turned the tide of the battle. The Persians, their superior numbers rendered useless by the terrain and the Athenian tactics, were routed. They fled back to their ships, and the Athenians, in a moment of utter triumph, had won the day. The number of Persian dead was staggering, while the Athenian losses were minimal. The famous story of the messenger who ran all the way from Marathon to Athens to announce the victory, shouting, "Nike, victory," before collapsing and dying, is probably a later invention, but it captures the sheer drama of the moment. The Persian army, humiliated and defeated, sailed back to Asia. The Battle of Marathon was a shocking upset, a victory for the underdog that resonated throughout the Greek world and, as we'll see, had a profound effect on the course of history. It was a humiliating defeat for the Persian Empire, a temporary check on its seemingly unstoppable expansion. For Darius, it was a personal failure, a reminder that even the great king could be challenged and defeated. He immediately began to plan a third, even larger invasion, one that would be so massive it would crush the Greeks once and for all. But before he could launch it, he died in 486 BCE, leaving the unfinished business of punishing the Greeks to his son, Xerxes. With his father, Darius the Great, now gone, the task of avenging the humiliating defeat at Marathon fell to his son, Xerxes III. Unlike his father, Xerxes had not earned his position on the battlefield. and he felt the weight of expectation. He wasn't just planning an invasion, he was orchestrating a spectacle, an act of sheer military might designed to be so overwhelming that the Greeks wouldn't even consider resistance. This wasn't a punishment raid. This was a statement. Xerxes spent years preparing, amassing a colossal army and navy from all corners of his empire. The numbers are almost comically large, with Herodotus, our friend from earlier, claiming the land army alone numbered in the millions, while modern historians, bless their skeptical hearts, put the number closer to 100,000 to 300,000. It was still a force of a size and scale that the ancient world had never seen. But assembling the army was only half the battle. Getting them to Greece was the real challenge. The last Persian fleet had been wrecked in a storm, so Xerxes' engineers set about building two ingenious bridges made of ships lashed together across the Hellespont, the narrow strait that separates Asia from Europe. The first one was destroyed by a storm, and Xerxes, in a moment that reveals his legendary hubris, was so enraged that he ordered the sea to be whipped with 300 lashes and had the engineers beheaded. They built a second, sturdier bridge, and it held. The army, a truly cosmopolitan force of soldiers from every satrapy, marched across for 7 days and 7 nights, a logistical feat of staggering proportions. They were a walking United Nations of the ancient world, with Medes, Persians, Egyptians, and even Indians marching side by side. And as if that wasn't enough, he also commissioned the construction of a canal through the Mount Athos Peninsula to avoid the dangerous headland where his father's fleet had been wrecked. This was a completely unnecessary but utterly showy bit of engineering, designed to demonstrate that not even nature could stop the great king. It was a kind of ancient hold my beer moment, but for all the engineering marvels and logistical prowess, the Persian army was about to run into a stubborn and utterly uncooperative group of people. The Greeks. The Greeks, for their part, were a mess. Their city-states were constantly at war with each other, and they were in no way prepared to face a unified, powerful invasion. But faced with an existential threat, they did something truly remarkable. They formed an alliance. It wasn't a perfect one, of course. Many Greek city-states were neutral, and some even sided with the Persians. But a core group, led by the Athenians and the Spartans, decided to resist. The first line of defense was a narrow pass in northern Greece, known as Thermopylae. It was a perfect choke point, a place where a small, well-disciplined force could hold back a much larger army. The plan was to use a small force to delay the Persians at the pass, while the main Greek army gathered and the Athenian navy prepared for battle. The man in charge of the Greek land forces was the Spartan king, Leonidas, a man so cool under pressure, he'd make James Bond look like a nervous wreck. He had with him a force of about 7,000 men, including his famous 300 Spartan hoplites. The Spartans were the most feared soldiers in the Greek world, professional warriors who had been training their whole lives for this kind of moment. They arrived at the pass and set up a defensive position, ready for the inevitable Persian onslaught. For days, the Persian army threw everything they had at the Greeks. Their elite immortals, a name for their professional guard that makes them sound like something out of a comic book, were sent in. but they were no match for the disciplined Spartan phalanx. The Greeks held their ground, inflicting massive casualties on the Persian army and frustrating Xerxes to no end. It was like trying to punch through a brick wall. But then came the inevitable betrayal. A local Greek, a man named Ephialtes, a name that would become synonymous with betrayal, showed the Persians a hidden goat path that led behind the Greek lines. The Persians, using this secret path, were able to outflank the defenders. Leonidas, realizing he was about to be surrounded, ordered the main body of his army to retreat. He and his 300 Spartans, along with a few hundred Thespians and Thebans who chose to stay and fight, remained to hold the pass. They knew they were going to die, and they chose to do it for a cause greater than themselves. The last stand of the 300 at Thermopylae is one of the most famous and romanticized stories in history. They fought to the last man, dying in a hail of Persian arrows. Their sacrifice was a heroic, but ultimately tactical defeat. They had held the pass for days, delaying the Persian advance and allowing the rest of the Greek army to escape. But the Persians had won. The path to Athens was now open, and Xerxes's colossal army marched forward. The Greek world held its breath, with the pass at Thermopylae finally breached and the legendary Spartans vanquished. The path to Athens lay wide open for the Persian army. Xerxes, finally able to unleash the full might of his colossal force, marched on the city. The Athenians, meanwhile, had been preparing for the worst. Their great general and statesman, Themistocles, a man who saw the bigger picture, had convinced his people to abandon the city and put their faith in their navy. This was a hugely controversial decision, a heartbreaking choice to leave their homes and their temples to the mercy of the enemy. But Themistocles had a different interpretation of an earlier oracle that had spoken of a wooden wall saving them. While some took it literally, he correctly guessed it meant their ships. So, the citizens of Athens, in an act of truly profound faith and courage, evacuated their city, boarding ships and sailing for the nearby island of Salamis. When the Persians arrived, they found a city completely empty of people, a silent ghost town. Xerxes, in a final act of vengeance for the burning of Sardis, ordered the city to be torched, including the sacred temples on the Acropolis. The sight must have been an absolute horror for the Athenians watching from the island, the smoke of their homes and history rising into the sky. But Themistocles knew this was all part of the plan. He had lured the Persian fleet into a trap. The Greek navy, composed mostly of Athenian triremes, was waiting for them in the narrow strait between the island of Salamis and the mainland. It was a perfect strategic choke point, a place where the massive Persian fleet, with its superior numbers, would be unable to use its advantage. It was the same logic as Thermopylae, but on water. The Battle of Salamis, fought in September of 480 BCE, was a naval masterpiece and a turning point in the war. Xerxes, overconfident from his victory on land, had positioned his throne on a hill overlooking the strait so he could watch the Persian victory. He was in for a rude awakening. Themistocles used a clever ruse, sending a message to Xerxes, pretending to be a deserter, and telling him the Greeks were about to flee, luring the Persian fleet into the narrow waters. The Persian ships, so huge and unwieldy, became a tangled mess in the confined space. The Greek ships, smaller and more maneuverable, were able to ram and sink the Persian vessels one by one. Themistocles' strategy was pure genius, a bit like a tiny hummingbird, taking on a bunch of confused, lumbering eagles in a hallway. The battle was a resounding, utterly catastrophic defeat for the Persian navy. Xerxes watched in horror as his fleet was systematically destroyed. The loss of the navy was a devastating blow for Xerxes. With his supply lines cut and his army at risk of being stranded in Greece, he had no choice but to retreat. He left a significant portion of his army in Greece under the command of his general Mardonius, with orders to continue the campaign in the spring. Xerxes himself, humiliated and defeated, led the rest of his forces back to Persia. The Greek alliance, emboldened by their victory at Salamis, prepared for the final showdown on land. The next year, in 479 BCE, the remaining Persian forces under Mardonius met the unified Greek army at the Battle of Plataea. The battle was hard fought, but the Greek army, a coalition of Spartans, Athenians, and other city-states, finally routed the Persians. Mardonius was killed in the fighting, and the remnants of the Persian army fled back to Asia. The victory at Plataea effectively ended the Persian invasion of mainland Greece. The Greeks, with their smaller numbers and their divided loyalties, had done what seemed impossible. They had repelled the largest invasion in history. The Persian Empire, a juggernaut that had seemed unstoppable, had been checked. It was a humiliating and costly defeat, one that would have a lasting impact on both civilizations. For the Greeks, it ushered in a golden age of art, philosophy, and democracy. For the Persians, it was the beginning of the end of their outward expansion and a period of internal focus. Historians still argue whether the Greek victory was a fluke, a result of Persian hubris and poor strategy, or a true testament to the superiority of Greek tactics and a nascent sense of Hellenic unity. Perhaps it was a little bit of both. With the Persian invasion of Greece finally repelled, the great empire entered a new phase of its history. This period, following the humiliations at Marathon and Salamis, saw a pivot away from aggressive expansion and a focus on solidifying the immense territory it already controlled. It was a golden age, a time of relative peace and prosperity, and a period of monumental building projects that would come to define the Achaemenid Empire's architectural legacy. The capital of the empire was no longer just a collection of administrative centers. It was becoming a symbol of Persian power and a showpiece for the world. The most magnificent of these projects was the ongoing construction of the city of Persepolis. Persepolis, the ceremonial capital, was not a place where kings lived year-round. It was a place for celebrations, for the great Nowruz festival, where delegations from all over the empire would come to pay homage to the king and bring their tribute. The city was a marvel of planning and architecture, built on a massive, raised stone terrace with a sophisticated drainage system. The most famous structure, the Apadana, or audience hall, was a colossal building with 72 columns, each one over 60 feet tall. The sheer scale of it was meant to impress, to instill a sense of awe in visitors and remind them of the power of the great king. But the true masterpiece of Persepolis was its intricate stone reliefs. These reliefs, which decorated the grand staircases, are a window into the mind of the Persian emperors. They are not like the brutal, war-filled scenes of the Assyrians, showing kings stepping on the necks of their enemies. Instead, they show a peaceful, orderly procession of delegations from every corner of the empire. You can see the Medes in their rounded hats, the Babylonians with their long robes, the Ethiopians with their animals, the Greeks in their distinctive tunics, all walking in harmony, bringing gifts to the king. It was a visual representation of the Persian political philosophy, an empire of many different peoples, united in peace under a just and benevolent ruler. This was a form of propaganda, yes, but it was also a reflection of a genuinely tolerant and multicultural approach to governance that was unique in the ancient world. The long reign of Xerxes, despite the early Greek debacle, was one of relative stability. He completed many of the building projects his father Darius had started at Persepolis and Susa. But even in a period of peace, the court was a nest of intrigue and conspiracy. Xerxes himself was assassinated in 465 BCE, a victim of palace conspiracies that would become a recurring theme in the later history of the empire. His death ushered in a new era of dynastic struggles and internal strife that would slowly but surely begin to chip away at the edges of the Achaemenid Empire's power. The Golden Age was also marked by a subtle shift in Persian-Greek relations. The Greeks, emboldened by their victories, began to take the fight to the Persians, liberating the Ionian cities and even launching raids on Persian territory. But the Persians were not defeated. They had simply changed tactics. Instead of large-scale invasions, they began to use their immense wealth to fund and foment conflicts within the Greek city-states themselves. They would play the Athenians and Spartans against each other, using money and diplomacy to keep the Greeks divided and fighting amongst themselves, a kind of ancient geopolitical chess match. This was a remarkably successful strategy. For decades, the Persian Empire was a major, if often unseen player in Greek affairs, a kind of puppet master pulling the strings from afar. The King's Peace, a treaty negotiated by the Persian king Artaxerxes II, would later formally end the Peloponnesian War and establish Persian dominance over the Aegean, proving that what they couldn't win with the sword, they could win with the checkbook. This period of peace, which we can call the Pax Persica, allowed for a flowering of the arts and sciences within the empire. The royal road was not just for soldiers and messengers. It was a conduit for scholars, artists, and merchants. Knowledge and goods flowed from India to Egypt and back, creating a vibrant, multicultural society. The Persian court at Susa and Persepolis was a melting pot of cultures, a place where Egyptian architects, Greek artisans, and Babylonian astrologers all worked together under the patronage of the great king. This was the true legacy of Cyrus and Darius. The empire they built was not just a collection of conquered lands. It was a living, breathing, and prosperous organism, held together not just by military might, but by a system of tolerance and a shared economic prosperity. After the assassination of Xerxes III, the Persian Empire entered a new and much more turbulent phase. The golden age of grand building projects and relative peace began to give way to a period defined by palace intrigue, internal strife, and a revolving door of kings. This wasn't an immediate collapse, mind you. The empire was still a colossal, wealthy superpower, but its leadership was becoming a little less stable. The old unified power of a king like Darius was being eroded by ambitious courtiers, family members with a taste for regicide, and a general sense of unease. It was like a very large, very fancy boat that was still floating, but the crew was constantly fighting over who got to steer. The reign of Xerxes' son, Artaxerxes II, which lasted a remarkably long 40 years, was a period of relative stability. But it was stability that was won through political shrewdness rather than military might. He was the king who negotiated the so-called Peace of Callias with the Greeks, a treaty that formally ended the Persian Wars and established a kind of uneasy détente. This long peace was a sign of the new Persian strategy: less direct confrontation, more diplomatic manipulation. But even with a long reigning king, the seeds of future chaos were being sown. The various satraps, or provincial governors, were beginning to act more and more like independent rulers. They had their own armies, they collected their own taxes, and they often defied the king's orders. This was a direct result of Darius's system of checks and balances slowly but surely breaking down. The problem came to a head after Artaxerxes II's death in 424 BCE. The next few years were a confusing and bloody mess, a kind of ancient Game of Thrones. Several of his sons and grandsons seized the throne in quick succession, each one either assassinated or overthrown by the next. It was a period of utterly mind-boggling dynastic confusion. There was Xerxes II, who ruled for a mere 45 days before being murdered by his half-brother, Sogdianus. Then Sogdianus ruled for a few months before he was, you guessed it, overthrown and killed by another half-brother, Darius II. Darius II's reign was long, but it was a period of constant revolts, both from within the court and from the satraps on the periphery of the empire. He had his hands full, just keeping the whole thing from coming apart at the seams. This constant instability at the top had a ripple effect throughout the empire. The satraps, sensing weakness, became even more brazen in their independence. Egypt, which had been a difficult province to control ever since Cambyses' conquest, seized the opportunity to break away and declare its independence. This was a major blow to Persian prestige and a significant loss of wealth and resources. The Persians tried to reconquer it, but they failed. The Egyptians were free, at least for a while. The final and most famous palace intrigue of this period was the one that led to the reign of Artaxerxes II. He was the son of Darius II, and his accession was challenged by his younger brother, Cyrus the Younger. This Cyrus was not the great founder of the empire, but a young, ambitious prince who had been given the satrapy of Lydia and a huge amount of power. He was a favorite of the Greeks and had a personal army of Greek mercenaries. This was a dangerous precedent, a Persian prince using foreign soldiers to challenge the great king. Cyrus the Younger, with his Greek forces, marched on his brother's army in a desperate bid for the throne. The two armies met at the Battle of Cunaxa in 401 BCE. Cyrus was killed in the fighting, and the Greek mercenaries, now stranded deep in Persian territory, had to fight their way back home. Their journey, which would become the subject of a famous book by the Greek historian Xenophon, is known as Anabasis, and it provided the Greeks with an unprecedented look at the inner workings of the Persian Empire and its vulnerabilities. This was not a good look for an empire that was supposed to be the most powerful in the world. So, while the empire continued to function, its inner workings were becoming more and more corrupted. The once centralized power of the Achaemenid king was being challenged by a combination of palace intrigue and ambitious satraps. The long, slow decline had begun, a process that was not marked by a single catastrophic event, but by a series of small, internal failures. This was a classic case of an empire eating itself from the inside out. The Greeks, with their constant infighting, had missed their chance to conquer the Persians during the great invasions. But the Persians, with their constant infighting, were now setting the stage for someone else to do it for them. After the long, chaotic reign of Artaxerxes II, the Achaemenid Empire seemed to be on a slow-motion slide into irrelevance. But it wasn't quite done yet. A new king, Artaxerxes III, came to the throne, and he was a very different kind of ruler. Unlike his predecessor, who was a kind of weak-willed figurehead, Artaxerxes III was a force of nature, a ruthless and efficient military leader who was determined to restore the empire to its former glory. He was a man who understood that if you want to get things done, sometimes you have to break a few rules, or, in his case, a lot of people. His reign, which began in 358 BCE, was a brief but brutal period of recentralization, a final, desperate burst of energy from a dying empire. He started his reign by cleaning house, and by cleaning house, I mean murdering his brothers and a number of his nephews to secure his position. This was a common practice in the Persian court, of course, but he did it with a kind of cold, methodical efficiency that set him apart. With his power base secure, he set about the serious business of putting the empire back together. The most pressing issue was the number of independent-minded satraps who were acting like kings in their own right. He launched a series of campaigns to bring them back into line, and he did it with a combination of military force and cunning. The satraps' revolt, a major rebellion that had plagued the empire for decades, was finally and brutally put down. But the real target of his wrath was Egypt. For more than 60 years, the ancient land of the pharaohs had been an independent kingdom, a gaping hole in the map of the Persian Empire. Artaxerxes III saw this as a personal insult, a symbol of the empire's weakness. His first attempt to reconquer Egypt failed, a humiliating defeat that forced him to retreat. But he was not a man to give up. He spent years rebuilding his army and his navy, gathering a force so large that it would be impossible for the Egyptians to resist. He launched a second invasion in 343 BCE, and this time he was successful. The Egyptian pharaoh, Nectanebod II, was no match for the Persian juggernaut, and he fled the country. Artaxerxes III, finally back in control of the land of the pyramids, was said to have celebrated by killing the sacred Apis bull, a kind of symbolic repeat of what Cambyses had done a century earlier, a gesture that was both a show of force and a reminder that the Persians were back. The reconquest of Egypt was a monumental achievement, a restoration of Persian power that sent shockwaves throughout the ancient world. It showed that the empire, for all its internal squabbles, was still a force to be reckoned with. Artaxerxes III was, in many ways, the last great Achaemenid king. He was a restorer, a man who through sheer force of will and military might was able to turn the tide of decline. at least for a little while. He rebuilt the empire's prestige and its power, and he ensured that when the inevitable confrontation with the Greeks came, the Persian Empire would be at its strongest. Historians still argue whether his ruthless efficiency was a sign of a strong king or a desperate attempt to shore up a crumbling edifice. Perhaps it was a bit of both. He was a king who ruled by fear, but in a chaotic world, fear can sometimes be a very effective tool. But his reign, like so many others in the later history of the empire, ended in tragedy. He was assassinated in 338 BCE by his chief minister, a eunuch named Bagoas. Bagoas, in a spectacular act of betrayal, went on to murder all of the king's sons except one, a young boy named Arses, whom he placed on the throne as a puppet king. It was an utterly cynical move, a power play that showed just how far the court had fallen. Arses, of course, proved to be an inconvenient puppet and was murdered 2 years later, leaving the throne open for a distant cousin, a man named Darius III. Darius III was not a soldier or a great statesman. He was a kind of compromise candidate, a man who, as we'll see, was completely unprepared for the storm that was brewing on his western border. The Persian Empire had been saved, but it was a fleeting victory, a final burst of light before the long, dark night. The stage was set for the final, bloody act, and the curtain was about to rise. With the death of Artaxerxes III and the puppet reign of his son, the Persian Empire was once again in a state of chaos. The vast, intricate machine that Darius III had built was beginning to sputter and fail. The final decline was not a sudden, dramatic fall, but a slow, agonizing process. The treasury was depleted by a century of court intrigues and military campaigns, and the army, once the most feared in the world, was now a mix of conscripts and mercenaries, lacking the cohesion and discipline of the forces that had marched on Greece. The satraps, sensing the weakness at the center, became even more independent, acting like their own petty kings and often fighting among themselves. This created a fractured and disorganized empire, one that was no longer able to respond to a major external threat. The man who was about to inherit this sprawling, beautiful mess was Darius III. He was not a son of the previous king, but a distant cousin, a kind of compromise candidate chosen by the powerful eunuch Bagoas after he had murdered the previous king. Darius III, whose birth name was Codomanus, was a man of noble birth, but he was not a great statesman or a brilliant military commander. He was a man who, by all accounts, was chosen for his weakness, a king who was supposed to be a puppet of the court. But he was no fool. He quickly saw through Bagoas's manipulations and, in a moment of shrewdness that would prove to be his greatest act of power, he had the eunuch poisoned. He was now the master of the empire, but it was a kingdom in disarray, a house of cards just waiting for a strong wind to blow it over. While the Persians were busy fighting among themselves, a new and formidable power was rising on their western border, a power that had been silently preparing for this exact moment. The Kingdom of Macedon, a formerly minor power on the periphery of the Greek world, was under the control of a military genius named Philip II. Philip was a revolutionary. He wasn't a charming politician or a diplomatic schemer. He was a hard-nosed soldier who saw the Greeks' constant infighting as a weakness to be exploited. He took the Macedonian army, a disorganized and undisciplined force, and transformed it into a professional military machine. He introduced the sarissa, a ridiculously long spear, which, when used in a tightly packed phalanx, was an impenetrable wall of steel. He perfected the combined arms approach, using his heavy infantry to pin down the enemy and his elite cavalry to deliver the killing blow. Philip's goal was not just to dominate Greece. His real ambition was to invade the Persian Empire. He saw it as a rich, weak, and ripe target. He spent years conquering and uniting the Greek city-states, using a combination of military force and clever diplomacy. He was a master of the carrot and the stick, convincing the Greeks that a unified front was the only way to defeat their common enemy, the Persians. He formed the League of Corinth, a military alliance of Greek city-states, with himself as its leader, and declared a pan-Hellenic war on Persia. The stage was set, the invasion force was assembled, the plans were drawn, and the great war machine was ready to roll. But just as he was about to launch the invasion, Philip II was assassinated. He was murdered in 336 BCE by his bodyguard in a moment of palace intrigue that remains one of history's great mysteries. His death, however, did not stop the invasion. It simply delayed it and put an even more brilliant and ambitious man in charge, his son, a young man who had been tutored by the great Greek philosopher Aristotle and had already proven himself a formidable military leader, was about to inherit the Macedonian throne. His name was Alexander. Darius III, sitting on his throne in Susa, probably heard the news of Philip's death and breathed a sigh of relief. He had no idea that he had just dodged a bullet, only to be hit by a cannonball. The long, slow decline of the Achaemenid Empire was about to come to a sudden and very violent end. The Persian Empire had prepared for an invasion, but it was about to face a force of nature, a man who would forever be known as Alexander the Great. With Philip II now dead, the weight of the Macedonian throne and the ambitious plan to invade the Persian Empire fell upon his 20-year-old son, Alexander. The young man, who had already commanded a cavalry wing at the Battle of Chaeronea and had been tutored by Aristotle, was no ordinary heir. He was a force of nature, a man driven by a profound ambition to not just conquer, but to surpass the great heroes of myth, particularly Achilles, the protagonist of his favorite book, Homer's Iliad. He was a military genius, a charismatic leader, and a relentless conqueror who would lead his army on a journey that would forever change the world. Darius III, the new king of Persia, was a man completely unprepared for this storm. He had a vast empire at his command, but it was a fragmented one, ruled by satraps who were often more loyal to themselves than to the great king. His army, while large, was a motley collection of different peoples, each with their own fighting style and command structure, a kind of military United Nations that didn't always get along. Alexander, on the other hand, had a smaller but highly professional and cohesive force, a military machine that his father had spent decades perfecting. He had a corps of veteran Macedonian soldiers and the best cavalry in the world, the companion cavalry, a kind of ancient special forces unit. The stage was set for a classic confrontation between a smaller, more disciplined force and a larger, less organized one. Alexander's invasion began in 334 BCE, when he crossed the Hellespont into Asia Minor. He didn't just walk across, he did it with a theatrical flourish, throwing his spear into the Asian soil and declaring that he was accepting the continent as a gift from the gods. It was a kind of ancient performance art, and it was a sign of the kind of king he was going to be. His first major test came at the Battle of the Granicus River, where he met a large Persian force commanded by a number of satraps and a contingent of Greek mercenaries. The Persians had chosen their ground carefully, using the steep banks of the river to their advantage. But Alexander was not one to wait. He led a direct charge across the river, a move that was so bold it was almost insane. He fought on the front lines, a true warrior king, and was almost killed in the fighting. But his charge worked. The Persian line broke, and their army was routed. It was a shocking and decisive victory, one that immediately put the Ionian Greek cities back in his hands and sent a clear message to the world. The Macedonians were not here to play. After the victory at Granicus, Alexander didn't stop. He marched down the western coast of Asia Minor, liberating the Greek cities and consolidating his control over the region. He was not just a conqueror. He was a liberator, a hero to the Greeks who had long been under Persian rule. He was a master of propaganda, a man who understood the power of a good story. He even visited the ancient city of Gordium, where a prophecy said that whoever could untie a complex knot, the Gordian knot, would become the master of Asia. When he couldn't untie it, he simply took out his sword and sliced it in half. It was a brilliant theatrical moment, a perfect symbol of his approach to problems. If you can't solve it the conventional way, just take a new and more direct approach. Darius III, who had been sitting back in his capital, was finally beginning to understand the magnitude of the threat. He had underestimated this young upstart from the backwater of Macedon, and it had cost him an entire satrapy. He decided it was time to take matters into his own hands. He assembled an even larger army, a truly colossal force, and marched to meet Alexander in person. The two armies would finally meet in a narrow coastal plain in what is now modern-day Turkey. The location, however, was a mistake on Darius's part. The narrow terrain would nullify his numerical advantage and give Alexander's smaller, more disciplined force a fighting chance. The stage was set for the first great confrontation between the two kings, a battle that would determine the fate of the Persian Empire. After the swift and decisive victory at the Granicus River, Alexander and his army marched south along the coast of Asia Minor. His goal wasn't just to win battles, it was to starve the Persian war machine of its resources. The Persian Empire was a sea-based power, relying on its vast navy to control the Mediterranean and Aegean seas. By capturing the coastal cities, Alexander would deny the Persian fleet access to ports and supplies, forcing it to disband without a single major naval battle. This was a brilliant strategy, a kind of military jiu-jitsu that used the enemy's own strength against them. One of the last holdouts was the island city of Tyre. Tyre was a formidable fortress, a city built on a small island a half-mile off the coast. It was known for its impregnable walls and its powerful navy. The Tyrians, feeling pretty secure behind their watery defenses, refused to open their gates to Alexander. They probably thought they were being clever, a kind of ancient, "you can't touch this." But Alexander was not a man to be trifled with. He decided to build a causeway, a stone and timber bridge, from the mainland to the island, an insane feat of engineering that his men probably thought was a fool's errand. The project took 7 months, with the Macedonians constantly under attack from the Tyrian navy. But they persevered, building a massive siege tower and using it to finally breach the city walls. The siege of Tyre was a demonstration of Alexander's unwavering determination, a kind of ancient, come at me, bro. It showed that if he wanted something, he would get it, no matter how difficult the task. With Tyre finally conquered, Alexander continued his march south to Egypt. The Egyptians, who had just been so brutally reconquered by the Persians under Artaxerxes III, were more than ready for a change of management. Alexander, who had already heard whispers of the Persians' tyrannical rule in Egypt, presented himself not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. He was welcomed with open arms, crowned pharaoh in Memphis, and treated as a divine savior. This was a masterstroke of political theater, a brilliant move that won him the loyalty of a key part of the Persian Empire without a single battle. He honored the local gods, visited the oracle of Ammon in the Siwa oasis, the same one that had supposedly swallowed Cambyses' army, and was confirmed as a son of the god, a kind of divine legitimacy that cemented his rule. And in a final gesture of his far-sighted vision, he founded a new city at the mouth of the Nile, a city that would one day become a center of learning and trade for the entire ancient world. Alexandria. While Alexander was busy with Egypt, Darius III was putting the final touches on his grand plan to defeat him. The Persian king had had plenty of time to assemble a new, even larger army, a force so massive it was said to have numbered in the hundreds of thousands. He had chosen his ground carefully this time, a wide, open plain near the city of Gaugamela. It was a perfect spot for his superior numbers, his scythed chariots, and his elephants to be used to their full advantage. He was not going to make the same mistake he had made at Issus. The stage was set for the final, epic confrontation between the two kings. Alexander, with his much smaller army, had to face the largest force he had ever encountered on an open field. The fate of the Persian Empire, the one that had been founded by Cyrus and built by Darius III, now rested on the outcome of a single battle. The long, slow decline had led to this moment. The palace intrigue, the weak kings, the rebellious satraps, all of it was about to be put to the test against a single man who had no intention of losing. The Achaemenid Empire, with its traditions of tolerance and its monuments of power, was about to face its final judgment. Darius was confident. He had the numbers, he had the elephants, he had the home field advantage. What could possibly go wrong? With the Persian Empire and the Macedonian army facing each other on the vast plains of Gaugamela, the stage was set for the final epic showdown. Darius III, learning from his past mistakes at Issus, had chosen this location specifically because it was a wide, open field, perfect for his immense army to deploy and use its superior numbers. He had even had the ground leveled to make it easier for his scythed chariots, a kind of ancient lawnmower of death, to operate. He had also positioned his forces to maximize their impact, with his cavalry on the wings and his elite infantry in the center. And he had even brought in 15 war elephants, a terrifying sight for an army that had never seen them before. He was confident. He had the numbers, he had the terrain, and he was ready for a decisive victory. Alexander, on the other hand, had a much smaller force, probably no more than 47,000 men. He knew he couldn't win a straight-up slugfest. He had to be smarter, faster, and more daring than his opponent. His plan was a masterpiece of tactical brilliance, a kind of ancient dance of death that would exploit every weakness in the Persian line. He placed his army in a wedge formation, with his famous companion cavalry on the right, under his personal command, and his infantry in the center. But the most important part of his plan was the feint. He marched his army at an angle, slowly moving to the right, a move that forced the Persian cavalry on the left to follow them to prevent being outflanked. This created a gap in the Persian line, a tiny, almost invisible hole in the enemy's defenses. The battle began with the Persians launching their scythed chariots. It was a terrifying sight, but Alexander's troops were ready. They were trained to open their ranks, allowing the chariots to pass through, and then stab the horses and the drivers from the side. It was a clever counter-tactic that rendered the Persian chariots almost completely useless. With the chariots neutralized, the real fight began. The two armies clashed, a cacophony of steel on steel and the roar of thousands of men. The fighting was fierce, a brutal melee that saw both sides give and take. But Alexander, ever the master of the battlefield, saw his opportunity. He led his companion cavalry in a charge directly into the gap that he had created in the Persian line. It was a risky, almost suicidal move, but it was a risk he was willing to take. He rode straight for Darius, who was positioned in the middle of his army. The charge was a success. The Macedonian cavalry, a tightly packed wedge of men and horses, tore through the Persian center, creating a panic. Darius, seeing his personal guard dissolving and the enemy king riding straight for him, did what a lot of people would do in his shoes. He fled. He turned his chariot around and rode off the battlefield, leaving his army to their fate. The sight of their king abandoning them was a catastrophic blow to the Persians' morale. The army, which had been fighting so fiercely just moments before, began to dissolve. The Macedonians, seeing their enemy turn tail, pursued them, turning the fierce battle into a bloody rout. The Persian army, a force that had been assembled from all corners of the empire, was shattered. It was a decisive, stunning victory for Alexander. The Battle of Gaugamela, fought in 331 BCE, was not just a battle. It was the death knell of the Achaemenid Empire. While Darius escaped, his power was broken. He had lost his army, his prestige, and the will of his people. Alexander, meanwhile, had won the most important battle of his career. He now had a clear path to the great Persian capitals. He went on to capture Babylon, where he was welcomed as a liberator, just as Cyrus had been. He then marched on to Susa, and finally to the magnificent ceremonial capital of Persepolis. The city, a symbol of Persian power, was plundered, and then, in a fit of either drunken rage or calculated vengeance, was torched. The great palace that Darius and Xerxes had built, a testament to their power and their vision, was burned to the ground. The great empire that had ruled the world for over 200 years had finally fallen. With the Achaemenid Empire now broken, its great cities captured, and its ceremonial capital in ruins, the final act of this grand tragedy was the pursuit and death of its last king, Darius III. After his humiliating flight from the Battle of Gaugamela, Darius was no longer a king with an empire. He was a king on the run. He fled eastward into the mountains of Media, and then into the remote regions of Parthia and Bactria, hoping to raise a new army from the remaining loyal satraps and continue the fight. Alexander, however, was not one to give up the chase. He knew that as long as Darius was alive, he would be a symbol of Persian resistance, a potential rallying point for future rebellions. So, Alexander and his elite cavalry pursued him relentlessly across the vast, unforgiving landscape. The chase was a race against time, a personal vendetta that was a testament to Alexander's singular focus. He rode day and night, pushing his men and his horses to the limit, his mind set on one thing: capturing or killing the Persian king. But the Persian court, which had already seen its king abandon his army twice, was about to stage a final, brutal betrayal. One of Darius's satraps, a powerful and ambitious man named Bessus, saw an opportunity. He knew that Darius was a liability, a king who had lost the will to fight. He also knew that if he handed Darius over to Alexander, he might be rewarded with a position in the new regime. So, he and a small group of conspirators staged a coup. They arrested Darius, bound him in chains, and put him in a covered wagon. The betrayal was swift and merciless. When Alexander finally caught up to the fleeing convoy, he found that he had been beaten to the punch. Bessus had already declared himself the new king of Persia, taking the name Artaxerxes, and had fled further east with his small contingent. But what he left behind was a devastating sight. There, in the covered wagon, lay the body of Darius III, stabbed to death by his own men. The last great king of the Achaemenid Empire had not died in a grand battle, fighting for his throne. He had been murdered by his own subjects in a moment of utter humiliation and betrayal. The great dynasty, the one that had ruled for over 200 years, had come to a pathetic and ignoble end. The moment Alexander came upon the body of Darius is a powerful and iconic image. The Macedonian conqueror, who had been so obsessed with capturing his rival, was said to have been genuinely moved by the sight. He threw his cloak over the body, gave Darius a proper royal funeral, and sent his body back to Persepolis to be buried with his ancestors. This was not an act of mercy. It was a clever political move. By giving Darius a proper burial, Alexander was signaling to the Persians that he was not a mere conqueror, but a legitimate successor to the Achaemenid kings, a new ruler who respected the old traditions. He had avenged the death of the last true king, and he would hunt down and execute Bessus for the crime. He was, in a sense, a new Cyrus, a man who would absorb the empire and rule it with a new kind of authority. The death of Darius III marked the end of an era. The Achaemenid dynasty, which had been founded by Cyrus the Great, was no more. The Persian Empire, which had been a superpower for over 2 centuries, was now a conquered land, a vast and diverse territory under the control of a young Macedonian king. The age of the great kings was over, and the age of the Hellenistic kingdoms was about to begin. The final, bloody act was a testament to the fact that great empires do not always fall in a single moment of glory. Sometimes they simply fade away, consumed by a combination of external threats and internal decay, and the last of their kings dies in a ditch, murdered by the very people who were supposed to protect him. With the Achaemenid Empire now a thing of the past and its last king, Darius III, dead, Alexander the Great was faced with a new challenge: how to rule this sprawling, beautiful mess he had just conquered. He wasn't just a conqueror, he was a revolutionary. He had defeated the Persians on the battlefield, but he knew he couldn't rule them with a sword alone. He had to win their hearts and minds, to show them that he was not a foreign tyrant, but a legitimate successor to the great kings. His approach was a masterclass in cultural blending, a fusion of Greek and Persian traditions that would come to define the Hellenistic world for centuries. He began by adopting Persian customs. He started wearing Persian dress, a move that probably made his Macedonian veterans cringe, but was a brilliant piece of political theater. He held court in the old Persian capitals, sitting on the throne of Darius and living in the palaces of the great kings. He even married a Persian princess, Roxana, a move that was as much about politics as it was about love. He encouraged his soldiers to intermarry with Persian women, and at the grand Susa weddings, he personally married off thousands of his officers and soldiers to Persian brides. He was trying to create a new hybrid elite, a new class of leaders who were both Greek and Persian, a kind of ancient cultural experiment. This was not a popular move with his men, who felt they were being betrayed. But Alexander was a man with a vision. He was also a master of using the old Persian administrative system. He didn't tear it down, he simply took it over. He kept the satrapies, the provincial governors, but he made sure they were under his direct control. He appointed his own people to the top positions, but he also kept many of the Persian officials who had served Darius. He was a great believer in meritocracy, a man who saw no reason to replace a competent Persian with an incompetent Greek just for the sake of it. He also honored the old Persian gods and traditions, restoring temples that had been destroyed and paying respect to the local customs. He was, in a sense, a new Cyrus, a conqueror who understood that tolerance was not just a moral good, but a powerful tool of governance. But Alexander's rule, for all its brilliance, was short-lived. He died in 323 BCE at the age of 32 in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon. The cause of his death is still a subject of scholarly debate. It could have been a fever, an illness, or a slow-acting poison. But whatever the cause, his death plunged his empire into a state of chaos. He had no clear successor, and his generals, a group of powerful and ambitious men known as the Diadochi, immediately began fighting amongst themselves. The empire he had built with so much force and so much vision was, in a matter of a few years, torn apart. The different generals carved out their own kingdoms, and the old Persian heartland was eventually taken over by one of them, a general named Seleucus. The legacy of the Persian Empire, however, did not die with it. It lived on in the new kingdoms that rose from its ashes. The Seleucid Empire, which ruled over most of the old Persian territory, continued to use the Persian administrative system, the satrapies, and the royal road. The kings, though Greek, were forced to adopt Persian customs to rule over their Persian subjects. They built new cities, but they were often built on the sites of old Persian capitals. The blending of cultures, which Alexander had started, continued for centuries, creating a new and vibrant Hellenistic civilization that was a unique blend of Greek and Persian traditions. The Persian culture and way of life had been so deeply ingrained in the region that it was impossible to erase it. It was like a giant, ancient sponge that had absorbed its conquerors. After the fall of the Achaemenid Empire and the death of Alexander the Great, the old Persian heartland became a prize in the chaotic power struggles of Alexander's generals. The man who ultimately emerged victorious in this region was Seleucus Nicator, a powerful and ambitious general who had once served as a high-ranking officer in Alexander's army. His new kingdom, the Seleucid Empire, was a vast and sprawling realm that stretched from modern-day Turkey to the borders of India. But unlike the Achaemenid Empire, which was an indigenous creation, the Seleucid Empire was a foreign entity, a Greek ruling class on top of a Persian foundation. This created a new dynamic, a kind of cultural and political tension that would define the next several centuries. The Seleucids, for all their Greekness, knew they couldn't rule this vast territory without adopting some of the Persian traditions. They kept the old administrative system of satrapies, the royal road, and the tax structure, but they also introduced their own Greek-style city-states, which were centers of Greek culture, language, and art. They founded new cities with names like Antioch and Seleucia, which became bustling centers of trade and Hellenic learning. It was a kind of ancient colonialism, a Greek veneer on a Persian foundation. But the Persians, with their long and proud history, were not about to just disappear. They held onto their traditions, their religion, and their sense of identity, a kind of cultural resistance that would eventually lead to their own resurgence. The Seleucid Empire, for all its might, was plagued by its own set of problems. It was too big to control, and its various regions, from Bactria to Mesopotamia, were constantly trying to break away. This constant internal strife, coupled with a series of wars with other Hellenistic kingdoms, slowly but surely began to chip away at the edges of the empire. The eastern provinces, far from the central power of the king, were the first to go. In the mid-3rd century BCE, a new power, the Parthians, began to rise on the eastern frontier. They were a nomadic people, horse archers from the steppes, and they were a direct throwback to the original Indo-Iranian tribes that had founded the Achaemenid Empire. The Parthians, under their first great king, Arsaces, began to chip away at the eastern Seleucid territories. They were masters of a kind of guerrilla warfare, using their fast-moving cavalry to strike and retreat, a tactic that the slow-moving Greek armies had a hard time dealing with. The famous Parthian shot, an arrow fired backward over the shoulder while riding away, became a symbol of their military prowess. They were relentless, and over the course of the next century, they pushed the Seleucids out of the Iranian plateau and into Mesopotamia. The old Persian heartland was once again under the control of an indigenous Iranian people, a kind of poetic justice after centuries of foreign rule. The Parthian Empire, which would go on to rule for almost 500 years, was a kind of Neo-Persian kingdom. They were not just a military power. they were a cultural one as well. They were a fascinating blend of Iranian, Hellenistic, and even Babylonian influences. They adopted the Achaemenid title of King of Kings and used the old Persian administrative system. But they were also a decentralized feudal kingdom ruled by a powerful aristocracy that was often in conflict with the king. This constant internal strife, while a weakness, also made the empire resilient. It was a kind of flexible power, able to bend without breaking. They were the great rivals of the Roman Empire, fighting a series of wars with them over control of Mesopotamia. The Romans, for all their military might, found the Parthians to be a constant and frustrating enemy, a power they could never truly defeat. This new Iranian kingdom, this new Persian empire, had risen from the ashes, and it was a testament to the enduring power of a culture that had refused to die. The Parthians, with their constant internal strife and their decentralized feudal system, were a great power, but they were also a fragile one. The powerful noble families, who controlled vast estates and their own private armies, were often a greater threat to the king than the Romans were. This internal weakness, coupled with a series of devastating plagues and a changing climate, slowly began to erode the Parthian Empire's power. It was not a sudden collapse, but a long, drawn-out decline, a kind of ancient geopolitical sickness that slowly ate away at its strength. The Roman Empire, for its part, was a constant source of trouble, and while the Parthians were able to hold their own, the constant wars and skirmishes drained their resources. The final end of the Parthian Empire came not from a foreign power, but from within. A new dynasty, the Sassanids, rose up in the old Persian heartland of Parsa. They were a family of local rulers, and they claimed direct lineage from the ancient Achaemenid kings, a claim that gave them a powerful sense of legitimacy and a moral authority that the Parthians, with their nomadic roots, could never have. The Sassanids were led by a man named Ardashir Thurathuntu, a charismatic and ambitious leader who was determined to not just replace the Parthians, but to restore the glory of the Achaemenid Empire. This wasn't just a change of dynasties, it was a cultural and religious revival, a return to the old ways. Ardashir's rebellion began in 224 CE, and it was a swift and decisive affair. He defeated the last Parthian king, Artabanus IV, in battle and marched on the Parthian capital of Ctesiphon, a city that had been the seat of power for centuries. With the fall of Ctesiphon, the Parthian Empire was no more. The Sassanids, with their capital also at Ctesiphon, immediately set about a program of centralization and cultural revival. They declared Zoroastrianism to be the official religion of the state, a move that gave the king immense religious authority and a unified ideological base that the Parthians had lacked. They also began a program of monumental building, creating grand palaces and fire temples that were a testament to their power and their connection to the Achaemenid past. The Sassanids were, in many ways, the true successors of the Achaemenid Empire. They were a powerful, centralized state with a professional army, a sophisticated bureaucracy, and a clear, unified ideology. They were also a constant rival of the Roman and later Byzantine empires, fighting a series of long and bloody wars with them over control of the Near East. The Sassanids were the Romans' most formidable enemies, a power that could not be defeated, only held in check. The long drawn-out wars between the two empires were a kind of ancient Cold War, a constant struggle for dominance that defined the geopolitical landscape of the region for centuries. The Sassanids also became a center of learning, with their court at Ctesiphon, becoming a kind of ancient melting pot of cultures, a place where scholars from India, Greece, and Persia all came together to share ideas. The Sassanid Empire was the final great pre-Islamic Persian kingdom, a testament to the enduring power of a culture that had survived centuries of foreign rule. They were a return to the past, a restoration of the old Persian way of life. But their empire, for all its glory and its power, would eventually fall as well. The long, bloody wars with the Byzantines had weakened both empires, leaving them vulnerable to a new and completely unexpected threat. A new religion, Islam, was about to rise in the Arabian Peninsula, and its followers, united by a powerful sense of faith and a common purpose, would sweep through the region with a speed and ferocity that no one had ever seen before. The final chapter of the Persian Empire was about to be written, and it would be a bloody and definitive end to a story that had lasted for over a millennium. The Sassanid Empire, the last great Persian kingdom, was at the height of its power. For centuries, it had been the primary rival of Rome and its successor, the Byzantine Empire, a kind of eternal struggle for dominance over the Near East. The wars between the two empires were brutal, long, and ultimately self-destructive. In the early 7th century, a Sassanid king, Khosrow II, managed to conquer huge swaths of Byzantine territory, taking control of Egypt, Jerusalem, and even threatening Constantinople itself. It was the greatest military achievement of the Sassanid dynasty, a restoration of the ancient Achaemenid borders. But it was a fleeting victory. The Byzantines, under their emperor Heraclius, launched a stunning counterattack, pushing the Persians out of their conquered territories and back into their heartland. The Long War, which lasted for over 25 years, was a kind of ancient mutual annihilation pact. Both empires were left utterly exhausted, their treasuries empty, their armies depleted, and their people weary of war. It was into this power vacuum that a new and completely unexpected force emerged: the Arabs. They were a people who had long been a footnote in the history of the region, a collection of nomadic tribes on the periphery of the great empires. But now, they were united by a new religion, Islam, and a powerful sense of purpose. Their prophet, Muhammad, had forged them into a single, cohesive fighting force. And after his death, they began a series of military campaigns that would change the world forever. The exhausted Sassanid and Byzantine empires, which had spent centuries fighting each other, were completely unprepared for this new threat. They had no idea that their long, self-destructive war had left them vulnerable to a force they had completely ignored. The final confrontation between the Sassanids and the Arabs began in 633 CE. The Sassanid king, Yazdegerd III, was a young man, a kind of compromise candidate who had come to the throne after a long period of internal chaos. He was not a strong king, and his empire was in a state of disarray. The army, which was a mix of conscripts and feudal levies, was no match for the disciplined, highly motivated Arab forces. The Arabs, under their brilliant general Khalid ibn al-Walid, swept through Mesopotamia, winning a series of stunning victories that shocked the Sassanid court. The Sassanids, in a desperate attempt to stop the Arab advance, gathered a colossal army at the Battle of Qadisiyah in 636 CE. The battle, which lasted for several days, was a bloody and decisive defeat for the Sassanids. Their general was killed, their army was routed, and their sacred banner, the Derafsh Kaviani, was captured. The heartland of the empire was now open to the Arabs. Yazdegerd III and the remnants of his court fled eastward, hoping to raise a new army and continue the fight. The Arabs, however, were relentless. They pursued the Sassanid king across the vast Iranian plateau, winning battle after battle and conquering city after city. The final decisive battle was at Nahavand in 642 CE. The Sassanids, in a final desperate stand, were completely annihilated. The battle was a kind of ancient mutual annihilation pact, with the Sassanid army being completely destroyed. The Arabs, for their part, suffered heavy losses, but they had won the war. The Sassanid Empire, the last great Persian kingdom, was no more. Yazdegerd III, the last of his line, continued to flee eastward for another decade. A king without a kingdom, a ghost of an empire. He was eventually murdered in 641 CE by a local miller in a remote part of Central Asia. A final pathetic end for a great dynasty. The long and storied history of the Persian Empire, which had begun with the rise of the Medes and the genius of Cyrus the Great, had finally come to an end. The ancient world had given way to a new one, a world that would be defined not by the kings of Persia, but by the caliphs of Islam. The legacy of Persia, however, would not die with it. The Sassanid Empire had fallen, and with it, the long and storied history of the great pre-Islamic Persian kingdoms. But an empire, as a concept, is more than just a dynasty or a geographical territory. It is a legacy, a culture, a set of ideas that continue to influence the world long after the last king has died. The Persian Empire, which began as a small, insignificant tribe, left behind a legacy that is so profound and so far-reaching that we still feel its effects today. It was a kind of geopolitical DNA that would be passed down to all the empires that followed. A blueprint for a new kind of world order. The most enduring part of the Persian legacy was its concept of empire. Before Cyrus the Great, empires were built on fear, on the subjugation and enslavement of conquered peoples. The Assyrians, for example, were masters of terror, a military machine that ruled by mass deportation and brutal conquest. But Cyrus showed the world that there was another way. He ruled with tolerance, with mercy, and with a kind of enlightened self-interest that was utterly revolutionary. He allowed his subjects to keep their own religions, their own languages, and their own customs. This was not a moral stand so much as a brilliant political strategy. By allowing his subjects to be themselves, he made them loyal participants in his empire, not just reluctant subjects. This idea that an empire could be a multicultural, multi-ethnic organism held together by a common set of laws and a shared prosperity was a revolutionary concept that would influence everything from the Roman Empire to the British Empire and beyond. The Persians also left a legacy of administrative excellence. The system of satrapies, with its checks and balances and its network of royal inspectors, was an ingenious way to manage a vast and diverse territory. The royal road was a marvel of engineering, a kind of ancient internet that allowed for the rapid transmission of information and goods across the empire. The introduction of a common currency and a standardized system of weights and measures was a boon for trade and commerce, a kind of ancient free market that brought unprecedented wealth and prosperity to the region. These administrative and economic innovations were so effective that they were adopted by the Seleucids, the Parthians, and even the Romans. But perhaps the most profound legacy of the Persian Empire was its cultural influence. The blending of different cultures, which began under Cyrus and was accelerated under Alexander, created a new kind of civilization, a Hellenistic world that was a unique and vibrant fusion of Greek and Persian ideas. Persian art and architecture, with its grand scale and its intricate reliefs, would influence everything from Roman palaces to Islamic mosques. The idea of paradise as a walled garden, a concept that was so central to Persian culture, would become a universal symbol of peace and beauty. And the Persian religion, Zoroastrianism, with its concepts of a cosmic struggle between good and evil and a final judgment, would have a profound influence on Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And so, with the fall of the Sassanid Empire, the story of the Persian Empire, in its ancient form, comes to a close. But its legacy is still very much alive. It is in the words we use, the ideas we hold, and the very concept of what an empire can be. The Persian Empire was not just a collection of conquered lands. It was a living, breathing organism that changed the world forever. It was a story of a people who went from nomadic shepherds to the masters of the world. And in doing so, they left behind a kind of ghost, a kind of cultural memory that has outlasted every conqueror, every king, and every dynasty. And now, as the story of the Persian Empire fades into the quiet halls of history, you can feel the last echoes of a world of kings and empires softly recede. The scent of exotic spices on the royal road, the whisper of the wind through the columns of Persepolis, the distant clash of swords at Thermopylae. They are all becoming a part of the long, silent march of time. The grand narrative of rise and fall, of triumph and tragedy, is over, leaving in its place a profound stillness. It's a moment to let go of the grand battles and the powerful kings, and to simply rest in the quiet aftermath of a story so vast it seems to contain the whole world. The work is done, the history has been told, and all that is left is the gentle hum of memory. Just breathe now, feel the weight of your day begin to lift, and let your mind drift into the peaceful darkness. You are safe, you are home, and it is time to sleep.